In state politics, there's already growing anticipation about next year's election, but in the near term, there's also reason to keep an eye on what's happening with the new state budget and the upcoming Democratic Party convention. To bring us up to date is a reporter from Politco Massachusetts, Lauren Dezenski. Thank you very much for being with us, Lauren.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, talk about the convention, because this is going to be something of almost national interest here, at least a pattern that we've seen going on around the country.
Absolutely. We've been curious to see how the excitement from Bernie Sanders and his supporters will play out after November. That was kind of a question after the election. Now we have Our Revolution Massachusetts, which is essentially the self-described Bernie Sanders wing of the Massachusetts Democratic Party. It's a collection of 3 different groups that have come together and are now organizing around the state convention. They're basically saying that they've elected more than 700 delegates. This is kind of their first spot and chance to really flex their muscles. State conventions, at least when there isn't really a lot going on, which is now for the most part, aren't all that exciting. It's a little bit more exciting than last year's issues convention. Like, at least this year, Democrats will be talking about the platform and electing different planks of the platform that then the gubernatorial candidates will then run on next year. But still, there's not a lot of interest and intrigue. So this is a nugget that we can all kind of grasp onto and watch.
Well, these are Democrats against other Democrats. Is there anything about the agenda that Sanders supporters are pushing that's different from the mainstream?
So it's interesting because the Massachusetts Democratic Party platform is quite progressive. If you think about Democrats in Massachusetts, sometimes you think a little bit more along the lines of what you see on Beacon Hill, specifically in the House of Representatives, where it's a little bit more moderate. But the Democratic Party itself, they're quite progressive, and so the Sanders folks are pushing beyond that to a certain extent. We're seeing advocacy for single-payer health care, some progressive education components. They're really kind of pushing all of that. But it's a question of, just because it's in the party platform, will we see actual legislation and other things kind of develop around that?
Well, of course, the other litmus test for the Sanders movement around the country is how well its candidates are doing it, or how well candidates backed by Sanders are doing. Not that impressive so far. And
it stands to be seen, whether Our Revolution Massachusetts, whether or not they support a candidate. I think at least right now, among the 3 folks that have said that they're running, Bob Massey, Seti Warren, and Jay Gonzalez, I think Bob Massey probably would be the most likely kind of inheritor of that support. Dan Wolf could be an interesting pick because the former state senator, Cape Air CEO, who said that he's considering running, he actually did support Bernie Sanders, so he would kind of be the natural pick if he actually decides to run. So that kind of stands to be seen.
And the governor, he's raising a lot of money. Is he expecting a tough fight here, or has he got something else in mind, maybe?
It stands to be seen. Governor Charlie Baker and his finance team wanting to raise $30 million. I think when I read that story, my eyes popped out of my face a little bit. That's a lot of money. The interesting thing is that now we see people talking about, is Governor Baker doing this to not necessarily scare off opponents? Because I don't think a lot of people see 2018 as a tough re-election fight for Charlie Baker, but what kind of message does $30 million in your war chest send? Some people are asking whether or not it means that he'll make some sort of national run. The only caveat that I would add to that is that state campaign accounts can't translate over into federal campaign accounts. So if he has $30 million in his state account, he's going to have to then raise another $30 million to put it into a federal account for any sort of national run. But at the same time, it's a really impressive show of force that I think impressed a lot of people when they read the news on that this morning.
Of course, another thing happening next year, Elizabeth Warren is up for re-election. There's at least one candidate going after her. Is this anything to get excited about at this point?
It's something to watch. Senator Elizabeth Warren running for any sort of re-election, it's interesting. State Rep Jeff Deal, who is potentially running, we'll kind of find out. He says that he'll fully announce by the end of the summer. He's a semi-viable candidate. There certainly is opposition there. There are things that they can criticize her on, but whether or not the Republicans in the state can get enough of their resources together to actively wage a strong battle against her will be tough. If anything, I think the strength of Senator Elizabeth Warren and Governor Charlie Baker, it's almost, if either parties are smart, they can kind of run the two against each other, even though they'll be on the same ticket, but they're not actually running against each other.
Well, I do want to ask you about one short-term issue with the state budget that's going to probably loom larger next year, and that's about the nature of revenue. Because right now, one of the things that people are struggling with is that we don't have as much revenue as we were expecting, even though the economy wouldn't tell you that right away. Well, what's going on here?
Absolutely. So basically, legislators on Beacon Hill are attempting to set up the budget for next year. In the budget process, which, the governor releases his in January, and then the House is in March, and then the Senate just came out with theirs last week. As they have become closer and closer to actually determining the final budget, the amount of money that they've realized that they actually have to work with is less and less and less. This essentially puts determining the ultimate final budget for 2018 into the hands of a 6-person conference committee. One of the things that we're seeing is that this could potentially be the result of uncertainty in Washington. Basically, a lot of large companies and people with a lot of money are waiting to do things based on the promise of tax reform. And so they're taking these first-term losses, and then we're seeing decreasing tax revenues on the state level. So I think it's honestly just another example of issues in Washington and uncertainty in Washington filtering down into the state level and having local impacts.
Of course, when I look at the columns and I see the amounts that the governor wants, that the House wants, and Senate Ways and Means Committee wants, I see mostly small differences. So, it looks like that thing's not going to be too difficult to resolve.
It's essentially among the three parties that it's all the same amount, and they all basically said that everyone comes together before the budget process to agree on the consensus revenue number. Basically, this is the number that the state budget will be based off of, and that's what they're going to make their estimates off of. But now the consensus revenue number is off from the projected revenue number, and it's just a question of how much that is. So all of the initial proposals are similar amounts, but the actual number that all of it will be based off of is still up in the air. And we think it could be up to, $575 million. So it'll still be nips and tucks, but it'll be across the board for all three proposals.
You should mention the one thing which I thought is not a small matter at all, that the governor, the House, and the Senate have pretty much agreed on some kind of a levy on businesses to fill some of that gap in mass health, because more people are depending on that for their coverage now.
Absolutely. The Senate was interesting in how they proposed it, but essentially the governor initially proposed having small employers basically kick in an amount of money, because even though employers were offering health insurance, individuals were still choosing to go on to mass health. So this is another example of how healthcare is such a significant cost, and it's only going to get bigger. And even when we're looking at what's happening federally, it's still up in the air. I don't think anyone can really estimate what's going to happen, but it's already having a really significant impact on our budget. So if the state loses even more money, we're already talking about shortfalls now. There's going to be even more money that needs to be made up in the future.
I know it's too early to say what's going to happen in Washington, but if it's anything like what passed the House as far as the replacement for Obamacare, that's going to take a big chunk out of the state budget here.
Absolutely. We've seen Governor Charlie Baker come out against it. Obviously, both chambers are not big fans of it. The state gets a lot of money from federal healthcare waivers. So if things change, if that goes away, our already tight budget, which we're already seeing shortfalls, will then be even tighter with even greater shortfalls. I
want to turn to the city election here. We have a huge number of people running for some of the open city council seats, or seats that are going to be up for grabs. But one interesting thing is about the race for mayor, because we've been hearing a lot about Mayor Walsh, we've been hearing a lot about Councilor Tito Jackson, who's running against him, and now we're talking about Joseph Wiley, at least a little bit, because he's going to be on the ballot in that race for mayor in September.
Yes, we have a third candidate, which means that there will be a primary, in late September, and it it makes it a little bit more of a race. I think for a lot of us who watched the 2013 mayoral race, where there were 13 or 16 odd candidates for mayor, it brings back a little bit of the race, but at the same time, Mayor Walsh is still a strong incumbent. It's almost impossible for an incumbent mayor to be unseated. So it will still be an uphill battle, but this certainly does kind of raise the stakes a little bit. And it also means that everyone kind of has to fight a little bit harder for it.
Now, of course, this means things are going to be structured, so there might be some of these events, some news coverage happening, so Tito Jackson can get more exposure before the September preliminary, and of course, Joseph Wiley can too. But on the other hand, preliminary votes, the turnout tends to lag, and that usually favors incumbents. I'm not sure who gets the best break in this.
Absolutely. Councillor Jackson is fortunate because he's been out front in the fact that he's running against Mayor Walsh for so long. It'd be hard to say that he won't benefit from name recognition at this point.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Dezenski from Politco, Massachusetts.